Tom Pelissero from the NFL Network is joining us to tell us all about what he's heard, what this day is going to look like. Tom, Ryan Leaf here filling in for Rich. How you doing, buddy?
Busy, Ryan. This is a unique draft for a lot of different reasons. Obviously on the day of round one, there is, as you mentioned, always a lot of stuff flying, but just given the uncertainty with the quarterbacks, given the uncertainty in terms of the way the board breaks in the first round, I would anticipate we are in for a 12 or so hours of surprises.
What surprises today have you heard that you feel have some real validity? Because a lot of the stuff, and what I really do think is today is a microcosm of what the last 3 months have looked like. You really can't believe one word that's said out there because we don't have any idea why somebody's saying it, what their motivations are, until they actually step up to the podium and make their pick.
Well, that's exactly it. Right now, you have, every team, and I've had, right before you guys called and I hung up on your producer the first time. Sorry about that because I was on the phone with the GM. Everybody's trying to figure out what's going on, but it's not really going to become, in many cases, real until we see what happens for sure at number 3. Because as much as everybody, has speculated in terms of Mac Jones or Trey Lance, what happens at that spot is going to have a trickle-down effect on what happens elsewhere in the top 10. Who among the many teams that have been trying to trade up into the top 10, whether that's the Vikings, the Patriots, the Eagles, the Saints, who is willing to make that type of move and to give up the draft capital? There's just so many unknowns that, and again, we could have a deal at any point. We've already seen multiple deals in advance of the draft, people moving around the board. But a lot of the action is really going to occur within the round, which is going to make for exciting TV on NFL Network and some other networks I won't mention. But we may not know exactly what happens and how much of that talk becomes reality until we get going.
Yeah, I agree with you there. The 49ers, we know there's going to be a quarterback there. I really think the dominoes that could fall really hinge on the Falcons at 4 because they become, are they still a team that is interested in a quarterback, or did Arthur Smith, when he got there, find that Matt Ryan is still the guy and they can either trade out of that spot and do a lot of damage with some different draft picks, or they can take a guy there, and then you're talking about 2 quarterbacks now that can fall anywhere between 4 and 20 probably. But if they decide to move out of that spot or take a quarterback and you have the one out of the 5 left, you could see a bunch of teams wanting to jump up there to make sure they get the quarterback before they're all gone.
There's no question that 5 quarterbacks are going to go in round 1. At this point, I wouldn't rule out seeing all 5 go in the top 10 just because of the amount of teams that are hovering, and knowing you've got teams like the Panthers at 8 and the Broncos at 9 that potentially, even after Denver made a deal with Carolina yesterday for Teddy Bridgewater, and even after the Panthers acquired Sam Darnold, those teams still could be in the mix for quarterbacks. And that's why several days ago, that was the hot spot. 7, 8, 9 is where other teams were calling around in terms of potential trades. Now, in terms of Atlanta, certainly they evaluated their options. You have to remember Matt Ryan won the MVP 5 years ago playing a very similar system to what Arthur Smith is going to be installing. They have some weapons. We know about them getting calls on Julio Jones. Their salary cap situation is not ideal at all at this stage. We'll see whether or not anything happens there. The prevailing thought within the league in recent days has been that if the Falcons stay, which it seems, again, as of now, that they will, simply because they've been open to trades, they've gotten calls, they've not gotten anything that's made them to this point consider moving. The belief in the league has been that they take Florida tight end Kyle Pitts, which, if you still have Julio, would potentially give you Pitts, Julio, and Calvin Ridley all on the same team. And I talked with a coach about this last night who was saying, I understand all these people are saying you got to get rid of one of them. It's a great problem to have with the way you can stress defenses with those 3 guys, even if it's for just 1 year. So you've got a lot of young GMs, first-time GMs who are going to be making some of these picks. Trent Baalke at number 1 with the Jaguars has been a GM before, of course, in San Francisco, but that's a new program with Urban Meyer. You got a new coach at number 2 in Robert Saleh with Joe Douglas, who has not drafted his own quarterback, as Sam Darnold was from the prior regime. How is he going to handle this? The Falcons at 4, Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith. This is their first time going through this. And then at number 7, you got Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell in Detroit. What are they going to do? Scott Fitterer is a new GM too with Denver at 8, George Payton at 9 with the Broncos. All of which is to say, a lot of times teams are evaluating the track record of other people. For instance, when Howie Roseman is calling every team in the top 10, everyone goes, that's Howie. He calls every team every year about every pick. Maybe he moves up, but maybe that's him doing his due diligence. With all these new GMs who are looking, to make impactful moves, especially in the top 10, it really puts a lot of chips on the table in these situations, especially when you've got 5 quarterbacks that, depending on what team you're talking to, somebody's got them evaluated as potential franchise guys.
We're talking to Tom Pelissero from the NFL Network, SiriusXM radio host as well. Big day. What teams outside the top 10 are you looking at or focused on that are really trying to make an effort to get up there and move inside the top 10 to take a guy that they feel like they need?
Well, again, the Eagles have been making those calls for days, over and over. We'll see whether anything comes of it. Certainly there have been rumblings that they would be among the other teams. The belief has been they might be taking a defensive player, a corner, maybe Kwity Paye. But, GMs don't call and tell the other teams who they're taking, so that's largely speculative. The Vikings have made a lot of calls. Potentially if one of the offensive tackles slides, that could be somebody they're targeting. The Patriots have called up and down the top 10, looking for their possibility to get in. The belief among the other teams that have gotten those calls is their guy would be Justin Fields. And then I mentioned the Saints. And I know Ian Rappaport first reported that this morning, that they've been calling about moving up, potentially even into the top 10. There's a variety of different directions that could go. They are always aggressive. They don't mind bundling picks and ending up with fewer draft picks overall to go up and get one guy they like. They did it with Marcus Davenport a couple of years ago. They've done it in other cases. Would not surprise me at all if they get involved to move up. But the other thing is, again, going back to just because you don't know what happens at 3, you don't know who is going to begin to slide. You don't know what's going to happen necessarily at 4 or 5 either. Do the Bengals take Jamar Chase or do they take Penei Sewell? If they take Penei Sewell, all of a sudden the Dolphins are sitting there staring at Jamar Chase or potentially being able to trade down with somebody who really wants to go up and get Chase. There's all sorts of directions this can go, and the pivot point really begins with what happens at that number 3 pick.
Speaking of that number 3 pick, it belongs to the San Francisco 49ers. We're talking to Tom Pelissero from the NFL Network about today's NFL draft. So, Jimmy Garoppolo's name, of course, has been drug around since they've moved up to this spot. Initially, Jimmy's their planned quarterback. Whoever they get is a guy that's going to learn. But we're hearing some rumblings around him possibly being on the trade block. Again, rumors today. Where do we stand with Jimmy Garoppolo as the 49ers starting quarterback, and will that continue to be in 2021?
Well, my understanding has been you can anticipate multiple teams are going to be checking in with the 49ers about a potential trade. The one team that's obvious on paper and has been linked to this forever is Garoppolo's old team, the Patriots. But you've got some complicating factors in any potential Jimmy G deal because the 49ers, for one thing, are not going to give Garoppolo away. He could still, depending who they take at number 3, be their week 1 starter. He also has a no-trade clause that actually kicked in last month. It didn't exist in the first 3 years of his contract, but it does as of the beginning of the league year last month. And he's also due $25.5 million in 2021. So all he has to do to scuttle any deal is not agree to restructuring his contract. That's a lot of moving parts. It would be challenging for the 49ers to move him unless it would be part of potentially a bigger deal where some high-priced player is going back to the 49ers. Nothing imminent. There have been no discussions, I am told, about negotiating a new contract elsewhere, which would basically be a prerequisite to doing this deal. But that is going to be absolutely one of the things to watch over the coming days. We already got one quarterback trade yesterday with Teddy Bridgewater being dealt to Denver. Anytime, and that, of course, was a product of Sam Darnold being acquired by the Panthers. Anytime that you've got players joining teams, there is going to be some veterans who suddenly come available. The biggest challenge, perhaps of all, for moving any player, whether that is Julio Jones, Zach Ertz, any of the other names that we've heard in recent months, because the salary cap is down as much as it is this year, it's even trickier for teams to acquire a high-priced player. Nobody wants to take on salary right now. It doesn't mean that they can't, but you're talking about pay cuts and restructures, other things that are complicated. Remember, you cannot execute a trade for a player if you do not have the salary cap space. You can't say, well, we're going to restructure it. No, you need to have that worked out, or else the guy counts immediately against your cap and you're in violation. So any of those types of deals with veteran players, if they're going to happen, they can't happen while teams are on the clock unless you're a team that's sitting there with a mountain of cap space.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. You're not going to be able to restructure and move things around in 15 minutes before your commissioner gets up and announces that pick. Speaking of which...
And you can't physical a guy. You can't have the medical on him either, so you run the risk. Somebody comes in, fails their physical, you gave up a 2021 draft pick, now you got to figure out what to do, getting 2022 compensation. It's not ideal for anyone, which is why these deals need to get done in advance.
Speaking of making that draft pick, all right, you talked about it. You said the first round hinges on what the 49ers do and who they choose. Now, before I ask you who that's going to be, there's been speculation after Kyle Shanahan's press conference the other day that they moved up with no idea who they were going to draft, right? It was all five guys were very capable. We know Trevor Lawrence and Zach Wilson are going 1 and 2. That's been highly debated and been put to rest a while ago. It's between three guys. And they knew who they loved when they moved up. If they didn't, then that's a dysfunctional organization. If you're going to make that much movement, that many waves in a decision to move up and draft that high, you know who you love and who you're going to draft. So they know, and they've known for a while. What do we know? Who do they draft tonight, 3rd overall?
You're right that they had a very good idea at the time they made the move who they would be comfortable taking. Mac Jones from Alabama, from everything I understand, was the guy who was the easiest fit into their offense because he is a quick processor, he is accurate. Those are the two traits Kyle Shanahan looks for more than anything else. And Alabama runs a variation of the same system. So much like Zach Wilson, who we believe is going to be most likely, even though, of course, we can't tip picks, but every expectation is that he'd be the Jets pick at number 2. He also ran a variation of that same offense at BYU. It's much easier to project what quarterbacks are going to be, as you know well, Ryan, if you've seen them on tape making all the throws and doing all the things you're going to ask them to do in the NFL. But because the 49ers made that trade as early as they did, they had a chance to go in, see Justin Fields live, see Trey Lance live, get to know those guys, do Zooms with them. And it certainly sounds, in Trey Lance's case in particular, as if he was very impressive, which is not surprising. Of all the quarterbacks, all the players in this entire draft, there is nobody, based upon all the conversations I've had with coaches, with general managers, with scouts, who grades out higher in terms of the intangibles and the overall makeup than Trey Lance. You know, Trevor Lawrence, we've watched for 3 years. Everybody knows what he is. He has everything, checks every box as well. And that's not to downgrade Lawrence or any other quarterback in the draft. But there are rare qualities with Trey Lance that the 49ers are not the only team intrigued by. Very early in the process, everything I heard from scouts was, watch this guy rise through the process, because whatever you see in terms of holes on tape, and a big one for coaches is Trey Lance's accuracy, especially if you started, and the first exposure was that Central Arkansas game where he did not play well. He did not throw the ball well. But the more time you spent with him, from an intelligence, football IQ, work ethic, drive, all those things, everything lines up with Trey Lance, where, as one college scouting director put it to me, who just said it was brutal watching that tape, but he goes, whatever his ceiling is, he's going to get there. So it's the difference between, with Mac Jones, betting on the high floor, low ceiling. You know what he is. He's the most pro-ready, according to teams. Or do you bet on the potential low floor but potential high ceiling with the Trey Lance? And those are big-time organizational decisions that I don't blame any team for going through every single step of the process and figuring out whether or not you've got the right guy.
You didn't mention Justin Fields, and I want to ask you this last question before we let you go and get on your way. Why hasn't he been in the mix? He has all those things you talked about, a very high ceiling. He's played an incredible schedule over the last 2 years and one of the highest highest universities you can imagine in terms of competition, never lost a Big Ten football game. Why has he continued to slide, and why isn't he a reasonable answer for the 49ers at 3?
I would say, Ryan, it's too soon to say that Justin Fields is going to slide. There are a lot of people, particularly coaches, who love Justin Fields. We all know what the questions were going into the process. It was about processing because he's coming from an Ohio State offense that limits what the quarterback has to read. It raised some questions on tape, but everyone at Ohio State vouches for him. The coaches I've talked to who have spent time with Justin Fields say, yeah, he hasn't been asked to do certain things, but do I think he can do it? Yes. It was also about some of the early things you heard from a leadership perspective, going back to 2019, when he transferred from Georgia, didn't really get to know his teammates all that well, was just solely focused on winning the job. But the word on that improved out of the school in 2020, that he did step forward in a leadership role. He got praised for starting the petition to bring back fall football in the Big Ten. And we've obviously seen him take some big shots like he did against Clemson, things that would wipe out some other guys, come back in and play well. You like all those traits with Justin Fields. So the way that I have broken this down from the beginning, and Ryan, I will be honest with you, I haven't watched one lick of tape outside of the highlights I see on NFL Network. I don't know what I'm looking at. I'm not a scout. I'm not a former quarterback. I just know what people in the league think. And the way that the consensus breaks down within the league, and this was before the process, as well as now that we're right at the end of the process with the draft beginning tonight, it was Trevor Lawrence 1, Zach Wilson a close 2, then you had a group of 3 quarterbacks in Justin Fields, Trey Lance, and Mac Jones who are going to be ranked differently by every team. I guarantee you there are teams that have Justin Fields as the number 3 quarterback, if not higher than that, on their board. Consensus, Lawrence 1, Wilson 2. Those 3 guys are the next 3 in some order. But there's going to be variance just like there is in that next group with the day 2 quarterbacks of Kellen Mond, Davis Mills, and Kyle Trask. Those 3 are going to be ranked differently on every different board. And that's the beauty of the draft. It's about fit. It's about whether you bet on the intangibles. It's about, obviously, the physical traits that are going to jump out with some of these guys more than others. And Mac Jones is not going to look as good with his shirt off as Trey Lance and Justin Fields. That is just the fact of the matter. But he brings other things to the table. And if he ends up being the 49ers pick at number 3, it's because when Kyle Shanahan looks at him and he is in full control in San Francisco, it's the processing, it's the accuracy, it's his belief that that's the best guy who gives him the best chance to have a great deal of success in San Francisco.
Well, we all know who didn't look good in a picture at the NFL Combine, who ended up going to the New England Patriots and sitting in Josh McDaniels' offense. I like Mac Jones if he slides to 15 for the New England Patriots. We're talking to Tom Pelissero from the NFL Network. Thanks, Tom. We really appreciate your time. You can follow him on Twitter at Tom Pelissero. NFL Network provides live coverage of the 2021 NFL Draft starting tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern. Thanks so much for the insight, Tom.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
You bet.
Hey, you watched all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Watch more right here.